brass buttons hit the concrete with metallic clinks, one after another, each sound echoing through the courtyard like gunshots. Her hands remained steady at her sides as they stripped away everything she had earned, everything she had bled for, everything that had defined her for the past 8 years. The summer heat pressed down on Fort Braxton like a suffocating blanket, but the chill running through the gathered crowd had nothing to do with temperature. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Staff Sergeant Maria Castellanos had walked into that conference room 3 hours earlier with her head held high and her conscience clear. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she sat across from Colonel James Whitmore, his weathered face carved from stone, his silver hair reflecting the harsh lighting. Between them lay a single manila folder, its contents capable of destroying careers, ending lives, changing the course of military justice forever. "Sign it," Whitmore had said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years in uniform. "Sign the report as written, Sergeant. Walk away. Keep your stripes. Keep your pension. Keep your future." But Maria's dark eyes had remained fixed on the document. She knew what lay beneath the carefully crafted language, the sanitized version of events that painted a clean picture over a blood-soaked truth. 3 weeks earlier, during Operation Desert Shield in the mountains of Afghanistan, a convoy had been ambushed. 7 soldiers died. 13 were wounded. And according to the official report, it was an enemy action, pure and simple, bad intelligence. Wrong place, wrong time, no one to blame. Except Maria had been there. She had seen Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's hands shake as he ordered the convoy forward, despite intelligence reports of increased militant activity. She had heard him on the radio, demanding they maintain a schedule despite warnings from local informants. She had watched him freeze when the first IED detonated, leaving his men to fend for themselves while he cowered behind an armored vehicle. "I can't do it, sir," she had whispered, pushing the unsigned document back across the table. "Those families deserve the truth." Whitmore's jaw had tightened. His fingers drummed once against the polished wood. "Sergeant Castellanos, I'm going to ask you one more time. Sign the report." "No, sir." The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Outside the conference room windows, she could see soldiers going about their daily routines, unaware that their world was about to shift. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. "You understand what this means," he said finally. "Harrison has friends, powerful friends, people who don't like loose ends." Maria nodded slowly. She understood perfectly. She also understood that Specialist Tommy Rodriguez would never see his twin daughters grow up, that Corporal Sarah Mitchell would never walk her sister down the aisle, that Private First Class James Chen would never finish the engineering degree he'd talked about every single day during their deployment. "I understand, sir." Now, 3 hours later, she stood in the sweltering courtyard as Military Police Sergeant Davis removed her name tape with deliberate slowness. Each piece of her uniform told a story. The airborne wings pinned above her left breast pocket had been earned during 2 weeks of hell at Fort Benning, where she had thrown herself out of aircraft 13 times before her 18th birthday. The combat medical badge below them represented countless hours of training, of learning to save lives under pressure, of earning the trust of men who would literally bet their lives on her skills. The Expert Marksmanship badge had been won during a competition where she outshot Marines, Navy SEALs, and Special Forces operators, her hands steady despite the whispers that a woman didn't belong on the range with the elite. The Purple Heart ribbon had been earned the hard way, shrapnel from a roadside bomb leaving scars across her back and arms while she dragged 2 wounded soldiers to safety in Kandahar. But it was the Ranger tab on her left shoulder that drew the most attention from the gathering crowd. The black and yellow curved patch that fewer than 3% of the Army wore. The tab that represented surviving the most grueling military training in the world, where 60% of applicants failed before completion, where she had crawled through swamps, rappelled down cliffs, and endured weeks on 2 hours of sleep and 1 meal a day. Davis's hands hesitated for just a moment when he reached that tab. Even he understood what it meant. But orders were orders, and he pulled it free with a sharp tearing sound that seemed to slice through the humid air. The crowd pressed closer now, a mixture of soldiers from various units who had heard whispers of what was happening. Some knew Maria personally, Others knew her only by reputation. All of them understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. In 8 years of military service, no one could remember a Ranger-qualified soldier being publicly stripped of their uniform for refusing to lie. Maria's breathing remained steady as Davis moved to her belt, unhooking the polished leather with its gleaming buckle. Her combat boots, broken in through countless miles of running and rucking, were pulled from her feet. The digital camouflage blouse came next, leaving her in just her tan undershirt and fatigue trousers. Each removed piece was thrown carelessly onto a growing pile beside her, a mountain of fabric and metal that represented years of dedication, sacrifice, and achievement. Through it all, she kept her eyes focused on a point somewhere beyond the crowd, her military bearing intact despite the humiliation. Her hands never trembled. Her jaw never quivered. Her spine remained straight as an arrow, shoulders squared, feet positioned at exactly shoulder width apart. Even in disgrace, she looked like a soldier. The whispers grew louder as Davis reached for her undershirt. This was crossing a line that made even the most hardened observers uncomfortable. A few soldiers in the crowd shifted nervously, some looking away, others pulling out phones to record what they knew would become infamous footage. "This is wrong," someone muttered from the back of the crowd. "She's still a Ranger," another voice added, barely audible. But the orders had come from high above, from men with enough stars on their collars to make the sun jealous, from offices in the Pentagon, where politics mattered more than principle, where image trumped integrity, where a convenient lie was worth more than an inconvenient truth. Maria had known this moment would come the second she refused to sign that report. She had calculated the cost, weighed the consequences, and chosen her path. The same way she had chosen to enlist at 17 when her father lost his job at the factory. The same way she had chosen to volunteer for Ranger School when her drill instructor said women weren't tough enough. The same way she had chosen to stay behind and treat wounded soldiers while under enemy fire, earning her the respect of men who had initially questioned her presence in their ranks. As Davis prepared to complete his degrading task, Maria closed her eyes briefly and thought about Tommy Rodriguez's daughters, about the promise she had made to his widow to ensure the truth came out, about the letter she had written to Corporal Mitchell's parents, explaining how their daughter had died not from enemy action, but from the cowardice of her commanding officer. The truth was worth this moment of shame. The truth was worth losing everything she had worked for. The truth was worth standing nearly naked in front of her peers while they stripped away her identity piece by piece. Because some things mattered more than pride. Some things mattered more than career. Some things mattered more than the comfortable lies that let important men sleep at night while good soldiers rotted in the ground. Davis reached for the hem of her undershirt, his face flushed with embarrassment at what he was being ordered to do. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see how far this would go, how completely they intended to destroy a woman whose only crime was refusing to participate in a cover-up. And in that moment, as the fabric began to lift, none of them could have imagined what they were about to discover. The gasp that rippled through the crowd was audible, even over the distant sound of helicopters conducting training exercises. As Davis lifted Maria's undershirt higher, exposing her ribcage, every eye in the courtyard fixed on what none of them had expected to see. There, tattooed in bold black ink across her left ribs, was a perfect replica of the Ranger tab. But this wasn't just any Ranger tab. The careful observers in the crowd could see the subtle differences that made it extraordinary. Beneath the curved Ranger text were numbers, 1009, a date. And below that, in smaller script that was barely visible from a distance, were initials that made several officers in the crowd take sharp intakes of breath. Captain Jennifer Walsh, standing near the front of the gathered soldiers, felt her knees go weak. She knew those initials. Every Special Operations officer knew those initials. They belonged to Operation Ghost Trail, a classified mission that officially never happened, conducted by a joint task force that didn't exist in any Pentagon database. The silence stretched like a held breath as more details of the tattoo became visible. Woven around the edges of the Ranger tab were thin lines that, upon closer inspection, formed coordinates. Latitude and longitude markings meant nothing to most observers but everything to those who had clearance to know where American forces had operated in the gray areas between war and peace. Major Robert Kingston pushed through the crowd, his face pale beneath his service cap. He had been a lieutenant 10 years ago when Ghost Trail launched. He remembered the briefings, the carefully worded orders, the mission parameters that existed only in the memories of those who planned it. More importantly, he remembered the aftermath. The official reports listed 7 Rangers as killed in action during a training exercise. The closed casket funerals. The classified debriefings that required everyone involved to sign documents promising they would never speak of what really happened. But here was proof that someone had survived. Someone had lived through whatever hell had claimed the rest of Alpha Team. Someone had been out there for the past decade, serving in regular army units, keeping their mouths shut about operations that could topple governments if the truth ever surfaced. Davis's hands had stopped moving entirely. Even he understood that he was looking at something beyond his security clearance, something that made his orders to humiliate this woman seem suddenly insignificant. The tattoo wasn't just body art, it was a memorial, a secret, a burden carried in ink and silence for 10 long years. In the crowd, Master Sergeant Patricia Reeves stepped forward slightly. She had been a staff sergeant in 2009, working intelligence at SOCOM headquarters. She remembered the frantic radio chatter on October 9th of that year. Multiple units going dark in the mountains along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Search and rescue missions launched and quietly recalled. Body bags arriving at Dover Air Force Base under cover of darkness, their contents too classified for normal processing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The official story had been clean and simple. A training accident during mountain warfare exercises. Equipment failure during a routine rappelling drill. 7 dead, no survivors, case closed. The families were told their sons and daughters had died serving their country, which was true. They were never told that their children had been operating in territory that America officially denied entering, conducting missions that violated international law for the greater good of national security. But someone had survived. Someone had crawled out of whatever hell had consumed Alpha Team and made it home. Someone had carried the truth for a decade, tattooed permanently onto their body like a sacred oath. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson emerged from the crowd of observers, his weathered face grim. He had been the operations officer who signed off on Ghost Trail. He remembered the mission parameters. Infiltrate. Gather intelligence on high-value targets. Exfiltrate without leaving evidence of American involvement. The kind of mission that required Rangers because only Rangers had the training, the discipline, and the mental toughness to operate completely alone in hostile territory. When the team went silent, search efforts had been limited by political constraints. They couldn't send in the cavalry without admitting Americans were operating where they weren't supposed to be. They couldn't launch massive rescue operations without exposing classified programs. So they waited. And waited. And eventually declared everyone killed in action when no contact was reestablished. Except someone had made it out. Someone had survived whatever ambush or disaster had claimed the rest of Alpha Team. Someone had found their way back to American lines, been debriefed by people with clearances so high they didn't officially exist, and been quietly reassigned to regular Army units with their true service record buried so deep it would never surface. Until now. The tattoo told a story that no after-action report could capture. The precision of the coordinates suggested someone who had memorized every detail of their last mission. The date confirmed what Anderson already suspected. The initials woven into the design were those of Alpha Team members, Rangers who had died in service to their country and been officially forgotten by everyone except the woman standing before them. Dr. Sarah Collins, the base psychologist, watched from the edge of the crowd with growing understanding. She had treated soldiers with survivor's guilt before, but nothing like this. Nothing involving someone who had carried the secrets of classified operations for a decade. Someone who had been forced to remain silent about their service, their sacrifice, their loss. Someone who had been denied the recognition, the counseling, the support that came with acknowledged military service. The psychological toll of carrying such secrets was immense. To survive something that had killed your entire team and then be told you could never speak of it, never honor your fallen comrades publicly, never even acknowledge that the mission had occurred. It was a special kind of hell reserved for those who served in the shadows. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, a Ranger himself, felt a chill run down his spine as he recognized the craftsmanship of the tattoo. This wasn't random ink. Every line had meaning. Every symbol carried weight. The artist who had created this masterpiece had been told exactly what to include, exactly how to arrange the elements, exactly what story to tell in permanent ink. It was a warrior's memorial, carved into flesh instead of stone, a private monument to fallen brothers that could never be shared with the world, a testament to service that officially never happened, sacrifice that could never be acknowledged, heroism that must remain forever classified. The crowd continued to grow as word spread through the base. Soldiers emerged from barracks, offices, and training facilities, drawn by whispers of something unprecedented happening in the courtyard. Most came expecting to witness a routine disciplinary action. Instead, they found themselves staring at a piece of living military history. Among the newest arrivals was Colonel Patricia Hendricks, the base commander's deputy. She had spent 15 years in military intelligence, long enough to recognize classified material when she saw it, long enough to understand that the tattoo she was looking at represented operations that existed in the gray areas of international law, long enough to know that whoever wore that ink had clearances that went far beyond their apparent rank and position. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but nobody moved, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of base activities and the occasional helicopter passing overhead. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would be talked about in whispers for years to come. Davis remained frozen, his hands still gripping the fabric of Maria's undershirt, unsure whether to continue with his orders or stop. The woman before him was no longer just a staff sergeant facing disciplinary action. She was something else entirely. Someone whose true service record was buried so deep it might never surface. Someone who had sacrificed not just for their country, but for operations their country would never acknowledge. And in her silence, in her steady breathing, in her unwavering military bearing, she was telling them everything they needed to know about the kind of soldier she really was. The first person to break the stunned silence wasn't an officer or a senior enlisted soldier. It was Private First Class Danny Martinez, barely 19 years old, fresh out of basic training, who whispered the words that everyone else was thinking but afraid to say. "Holy shit, she's one of the ghost operators." The phrase sent a ripple effect through the crowd. Ghost operators were military legends, stories told in hushed tones in barracks around the world. Rangers, who operated beyond the reach of normal command structures, who conducted missions that left no paper trail, who could disappear from official records as easily as smoke dissipating in wind. Most soldiers dismissed such stories as fantasy, the kind of tales that grew in the telling until fiction became indistinguishable from fact. But the evidence was written in permanent ink across Maria's ribs, and suddenly those whispered stories took on terrifying reality. Colonel Harrison himself emerged from the administrative building, drawn by reports from his aide that something extraordinary was happening in the courtyard. The same Lieutenant Colonel Harrison whose cowardice had cost 7 soldiers their lives, whose career Maria was threatening to destroy with her refusal to sign the falsified report. His face was flushed from the heat and his own anger at having his authority challenged. He pushed through the crowd with the arrogance of a man accustomed to having people step aside without question. His silver eagles caught the sunlight as he moved, his jaw set in the hard line of someone prepared to see his orders carried out regardless of the consequences. He had spent the morning on the phone with his contacts at the Pentagon, ensuring that Staff Sergeant Castellanos would be made an example of, that no other soldier would dare challenge his version of events in Afghanistan. But when he reached the front of the crowd and saw what everyone was staring at, his confident stride faltered, the color drained from his face, as if someone had opened a valve and let all the blood flow out. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again without producing sound. His hands, which had been clenched into fists at his sides, began to tremble. Because Harrison recognized more than just the tattoo, he recognized the face of the woman wearing it. 10 years ago, he had been a major serving as a liaison officer with Special Operations Command. He had been in the classified briefing room when Operation Ghost Trail was planned, had seen the personnel files of the Rangers selected for the mission, had signed off on the operational security protocols that would bury any trace of American involvement if things went wrong. And things had gone very wrong indeed. The mission had been elegant in its simplicity. Alpha Team would infiltrate a terrorist training camp hidden in the mountains along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, gather intelligence on a high-value target planning attacks on American interests, and eliminate the threat without leaving evidence of American involvement. The kind of operation that required Rangers, because only Rangers had the training and discipline to operate completely autonomously in hostile territory. For 3 days, Alpha Team had sent regular updates. They had successfully infiltrated the target area, established surveillance on the terrorist compound, and confirmed the presence of their primary objective. Everything was proceeding according to plan until the morning of October 9th, when their communications went silent. Search and rescue efforts had been launched immediately, but they were constrained by the same political realities that had necessitated the covert mission in the first place. They couldn't send in conventional forces without admitting Americans were operating in officially neutral territory. They couldn't launch airstrikes without an international incident. They could only wait and hope for contact to be re-established. When contact never came, the operation was quietly closed. 7 Rangers were officially listed as killed in a training accident. Their families told they had died serving their country but never told where or how. The mission was sealed under classifications so high that acknowledging its existence would require presidential authorization. But someone had survived. Someone had crawled out of whatever hell had consumed Alpha Team and made it back to American lines. Someone Harrison had personally debriefed in a sterile room at Bagram Air Base. Someone whose survival had been so politically sensitive that they were immediately reassigned to regular Army units with their special operations background completely erased from official records. He had looked into those same dark eyes 10 years ago as she gave her after-action report in the clipped, emotionless tone of a professional soldier. She had described the ambush that killed her teammates, the 3-day running battle through mountain terrain, the impossible odds she had overcome to survive. She had done so without complaint, without seeking recognition, without asking for anything except reassignment to a unit where she could continue serving her country. And he had granted that request, believing he was doing her a favor by burying her classified service record so deep it would never surface. He had told her that her survival, like the mission itself, would remain classified indefinitely, that she could never speak of what had happened, never honor her fallen teammates publicly, never even acknowledge that Operation Ghost Trail had existed. She had simply nodded and asked where she would be stationed next. Now, as he stared at the tattoo that proved she had never forgotten, had never stopped honoring the memory of her fallen teammates, Harrison felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The woman he was trying to destroy, the soldier he was having publicly humiliated for refusing to participate in his cover-up, was someone whose service record made his own look like a training exercise. Master Sergeant Jennifer Kim, the base's senior intelligence analyst, had been quietly making phone calls from the edge of the crowd. With access to databases that most soldiers didn't even know existed, she had been able to piece together fragments of information that painted a picture of Maria's true background. What she found made her hands shake as she scrolled through classified files. Maria Castellanos had been recruited for special operations directly from Ranger School, where she had finished second in her class, despite being one of only 3 women in the program. Her psychological evaluations noted exceptional mental toughness, superior tactical judgment, and an unusual ability to operate effectively under extreme stress. Her marksmanship scores were in the top 1% of all Army personnel. Her survival training evaluations were literally off the charts. But, most tellingly, her personnel file contained gaps that could only mean one thing: periods of service that were so classified they couldn't be recorded in normal military databases. Months-long deployments that officially never happened, conducted by units that didn't exist on paper, in service of operations that required presidential authorization to even acknowledge. The crowd continued to grow as news of what was happening spread through the base communication networks that moved faster than any official channels. Soldiers arrived expecting to witness routine military justice, and instead found themselves confronting the reality that some of their colleagues served in ways they could never imagine, carried burdens they could never understand, and made sacrifices that could never be publicly acknowledged. Among the newest arrivals was Chaplain Robert Thompson, a veteran of 3 combat deployments who had counseled hundreds of soldiers dealing with the psychological aftermath of war. He took one look at the scene in the courtyard and immediately understood that he was witnessing something that went far beyond normal disciplinary action. The psychological profile of someone capable of surviving what Maria had survived, of carrying the secrets she had carried, of maintaining their silence and discipline for an entire decade, was extraordinary. Such individuals were rare even among elite military units. They possessed mental toughness that couldn't be taught, psychological resilience that couldn't be trained, and moral courage that couldn't be manufactured. And they were typically destroyed by the very system they served so faithfully. As the implications of what they were witnessing began to sink in, the mood of the crowd shifted from curiosity to something approaching awe. They weren't just looking at a soldier facing disciplinary action. They were looking at someone whose service had been so classified, so dangerous, and so vital to national security that, even acknowledging it existed, required levels of authorization that most of them would never possess. The afternoon heat seemed to intensify as more pieces of the puzzle fell into place, each revelation making Harrison's position more untenable and Maria's sacrifice more profound. The secure phone in Colonel Harrison's pocket began buzzing with an urgency that made his stomach drop. He knew without looking that it was his Pentagon contact, General Morrison, the man who had assured him this morning that Staff Sergeant Castellanos was just another troublemaker who could be dealt with quietly. The same man who had told him to make an example of her, to strip her of rank and dignity so thoroughly that no other soldier would dare challenge command authority. But General Morrison had been working with incomplete information. He hadn't known about the tattoo. He hadn't known about Operation Ghost Trail. He hadn't known that the woman they were trying to silence was someone whose classified service record was buried so deep that even Pentagon computers couldn't access it without specific authorization codes. Harrison's hands shook as he declined the call, knowing that ignorance was no excuse for what was about to unfold. In the world of special operations, there were protocols that superseded normal military hierarchy. There were people whose survival was considered so critical to national security that threatening them, even inadvertently, triggered responses that could end careers and destroy lives. Meanwhile, Command Sergeant Major Patricia Williams had been making her own discreet inquiries. As the senior enlisted advisor to the base commander, she had access to personnel records that painted a clearer picture of Maria's conventional military service. What she found was a pattern of excellence that spoke to someone operating far below their actual capabilities. Maria's efficiency reports were flawless, but they told the story of someone deliberately avoiding attention. Her commanders consistently noted her exceptional performance, but also her tendency to deflect recognition and refuse promotions that would have elevated her profile. Her volunteer activities were extensive but always behind the scenes. Her additional duties were always in positions that kept her away from public attention. It was the profile of someone who had been taught that invisibility was survival, that drawing attention could compromise not just themselves but ongoing operations that depended on their continued anonymity. Someone who had learned to excel while remaining unnoticed, to serve with distinction while leaving no memorable impression. But most tellingly, her medical records showed a pattern of injuries that were inconsistent with her official assignments. Shrapnel wounds that predated her acknowledged deployments, surgical scars from procedures that weren't documented in her service record, psychological evaluations that referenced trauma events that weren't explained in her personnel file. The pieces formed a picture of someone whose real military service had been systematically erased, replaced with a carefully constructed fiction that allowed them to continue serving while protecting operational security. It was a level of classification that most military personnel never encountered, reserved for operations that existed in the gray areas between official policy and political necessity. Dr. Amanda Foster, the base's chief medical officer, had been quietly reviewing Maria's health records from her position at the edge of the crowd. What she saw made her professional objectivity crumble into personal outrage. The medical history told a story of sacrifice that went far beyond normal military service. The shrapnel patterns suggested someone who had been caught in explosions designed to kill, not the training accidents listed in her official record. The bone fractures indicated trauma from falls or impacts that were inconsistent with peacetime training. The surgical procedures showed evidence of field medicine performed under combat conditions, wounds treated by medics working with limited supplies in hostile environments. Most concerning were the psychological evaluation notes that referenced survivors' guilt, post-traumatic stress, and what the examining psychiatrist had cryptically described as moral injury related to classified circumstances. The pattern suggested someone who had survived events that had killed their colleagues, who had been forced to make impossible choices in impossible situations, and who had been denied the therapeutic benefit of being able to discuss their experiences with anyone. It was a psychological profile that explained Maria's decade of silence, her willingness to serve in positions far below her actual capabilities, and her ultimate decision to risk everything rather than participate in another cover-up. Someone who had carried the weight of classified operations for 10 years had finally reached a breaking point where their conscience mattered more than their career. The crowd in the courtyard had grown beyond anything that could be dismissed as casual curiosity. Word had spread through the base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve, drawing soldiers from every unit, every rank, every background. They came expecting to witness routine military justice, and instead found themselves confronting the reality that some soldiers served in ways they could never imagine. Among the newest arrivals was Brigadier General Catherine Walsh, who had been conducting an inspection of the base's training facilities when her aide informed her of the unusual situation developing in the courtyard. As someone who had spent 25 years in military intelligence, she recognized immediately that she was looking at a classification issue that went far beyond normal base commander authority. General Walsh had been briefed on Operation Ghost Trail during her time at the Pentagon, though the briefing had been limited to acknowledging that such operations existed without providing specific details. She knew that Rangers had been deployed on missions that officially never happened, that some of those Rangers had never returned, and that the political sensitivity of such operations required absolute secrecy. But she had never expected to encounter a survivor of such operations, particularly not one who was being publicly humiliated by officers who clearly had no understanding of what they were dealing with. The protocols for handling classified personnel were clear and unambiguous, and every one of those protocols was being violated in spectacular fashion. Her first instinct was to order everyone to disperse immediately, to classify the entire incident, and to begin the complex process of damage control that such breaches required. But as she watched Maria standing motionless in the center of the crowd, maintaining perfect military bearing despite the humiliation being inflicted upon her, she realized that conventional responses were inadequate for this situation. This wasn't just about protecting classified information. This was about a soldier who had served their country in ways that required extraordinary sacrifice, who had been denied recognition for that service in the interests of national security, and who was now being destroyed by a system that had forgotten the very existence of their sacrifice. Sergeant Major Davis, still holding Maria's undershirt, looked around the crowd with growing panic. His orders had been clear and simple. Strip the sergeant of her uniform as a demonstration of what happened to soldiers who refused to follow orders. But those orders had been issued by officers who clearly hadn't understood what they were dealing with. Now he found himself at the center of what was rapidly becoming an international incident. The secure communications that had been flying between the Pentagon and various intelligence agencies had already begun. The damage control efforts that would follow would require congressional briefings, presidential authorization, and diplomatic assurances to allied nations that American covert operations hadn't been compromised. All because a lieutenant colonel with political ambitions had decided to make an example of someone whose service record was buried so deep that acknowledging its existence required security clearances he didn't possess. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Maria had refused to sign a false report to protect the career of an officer whose incompetence had cost soldiers their lives. In response, that same officer had ordered her public humiliation, inadvertently exposing classified operations that were far more sensitive than the cover-up he was trying to protect. The afternoon sun continued to beat down on the courtyard, but the oppressive heat was now the least of anyone's concerns. They were all witnesses to something that would be classified at levels requiring congressional oversight, participants in an incident that would generate after-action reports requiring presidential authorization to read. And at the center of it all stood a woman whose silence had protected national secrets for a decade, whose sacrifice had been erased from official records, whose service had been acknowledged only in the permanent ink tattooed across her ribs. The breaking point had been reached, and there was no going back. The black sedan that pulled up to the base's main gate carried no military markings, no official plates, nothing that would identify its occupants to casual observers. But the guards at the checkpoint recognized the type of vehicle immediately. The kind that transported people whose names didn't appear on visitor logs, whose meetings weren't recorded in official calendars, whose very presence at military installations was classified at levels requiring special authorization. Inside the sedan, Deputy Director Alexandra Kane of the Defense Intelligence Agency reviewed the classified brief that had been transmitted to her secure tablet 20 minutes earlier. The situation at Fort Braxton had escalated beyond anything the military could handle internally. What had begun as a routine disciplinary action had inadvertently exposed one of the most sensitive special operations programs in American military history. Kane had been DIA's liaison to Special Operations Command during Operation Ghost Trail, which meant she was one of perhaps a dozen people worldwide who knew the full scope of what Alpha Team had accomplished before their apparent destruction. She knew that their mission had prevented a coordinated terrorist attack that would have killed thousands of American civilians. She knew that their sacrifice had disrupted an international arms trafficking network that stretched from Afghanistan to European capitals. And she knew that their survival had been considered impossible by everyone involved in the operation. Everyone except the woman whose tattoo was now being photographed by soldiers with cell phones, creating a security breach that would require decades to fully assess. Kane's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Langley. The CIA had monitoring protocols in place for any mention of Ghost Trail operations, and those protocols had been triggered by intercepted communications from Fort Braxton. Satellite surveillance had been redirected to monitor the base. Signal intelligence assets had been tasked with monitoring all electronic communications in the area. The full apparatus of American intelligence was now focused on a single Army base in North Carolina because one lieutenant colonel had made a catastrophically poor decision. Back in the courtyard, the crowd had grown beyond anything that could be dismissed or controlled. Soldiers from every unit on the base had found reasons to walk past the area, drawn by rumors that spread through military communities faster than any official communication. What they found was a situation that defied their understanding of military protocol, classification procedures, and basic human decency. Command Sergeant Major Williams had taken it upon herself to establish some semblance of order, creating a perimeter around Maria that kept the crowd at a respectful distance, while preventing anyone from leaving the area until the situation could be properly assessed. Her military bearing and 30 years of experience commanded respect even from officers who outranked her, and soldiers instinctively responded to her authority, even as the normal command structure seemed to collapse around them. But maintaining order was becoming increasingly difficult as more personnel arrived with each passing minute. The base's dining facilities had emptied as word spread during the lunch hour. Training exercises had been quietly suspended as soldiers found excuses to relocate to areas with clear sight lines to the courtyard. Even civilian contractors and family members were beginning to gather at the edges of the crowd, drawn by the obvious significance of whatever was unfolding. Dr. Rachel Morrison, a clinical psychologist who specialized in treating special operations personnel, had arrived at the base that morning for a routine consultation on post-deployment mental health programs. Instead, she found herself witnessing a textbook case of institutional betrayal playing out in real time. Her professional training allowed her to recognize the psychological dynamics at work, but her human compassion made her want to intervene in ways that her security clearance wouldn't permit. She could see the signs of dissociation in Maria's perfectly controlled posture, the way someone with extensive trauma training learns to disconnect their consciousness from unbearable physical and emotional experiences. She recognized the hypervigilance in Maria's scanning gaze, constantly assessing threats and escape routes, even while maintaining the appearance of calm compliance. Most concerning, she identified the psychological preparation that preceded critical decision-making under extreme stress. Maria wasn't just enduring this humiliation. She was preparing for something. The secure communications network that connected Fort Braxton to the Pentagon had been overwhelmed with encrypted traffic as news of the situation reached higher levels of command. General Morrison, Harrison's contact at the Pentagon, had been relieved of duty pending investigation within an hour of the first classified reports reaching his superiors. The officers who had authorized Maria's public humiliation were discovering that their careers were effectively over, regardless of how the immediate situation was resolved. But the political implications extended far beyond military careers. Operation Ghost Trail had involved assets and operations that required coordination with Allied intelligence services. The British MI6 had provided logistical support. The Canadian Special Operations Forces Command had supplied technical expertise. The Australian SAS had contributed personnel and equipment. All of those partnerships were now at risk as foreign intelligence agencies demanded explanations for how their classified contributions had been compromised. In London, the Joint Intelligence Committee had been convened in an emergency session to assess the potential damage to ongoing operations. In Ottawa, the Prime Minister had been briefed on the possibility that Canadian Special Forces' involvement in classified American operations might be exposed to public scrutiny. In Canberra, the Department of Defence was calculating the political cost of acknowledging Australian participation in operations that officially never occurred. The ripple effects were spreading through the international intelligence community with the speed and destructive potential of a nuclear chain reaction. Meanwhile, Maria continued to stand motionless in the center of the courtyard, her breathing steady, her military bearing intact, despite the escalating chaos around her. But those who knew how to read the signs could see subtle changes in her posture that suggested she was reaching the limits of her psychological endurance. Her jaw was clenched slightly tighter than before, indicating the tremendous effort required to maintain her composure. Her hands, still positioned at her sides in perfect military fashion, showed the barely perceptible tremor that comes from extended periods of extreme stress. Her eyes, while still focused on a point beyond the crowd, had developed the thousand-yard stare that combat veterans recognized as the look of someone reliving traumatic memories. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Burke, a combat medic who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, recognized the signs immediately. She had seen that look on the faces of soldiers who had pushed themselves beyond the normal limits of human endurance, who had survived experiences that should have broken them, who were operating on willpower alone because their psychological reserves had been exhausted. Burke also recognized something else in Maria's posture that made her blood run cold: the subtle shift in weight distribution that preceded decisive action. The almost imperceptible repositioning of feet that allowed for rapid movement in any direction. The microscopic relaxation of muscles that indicated someone preparing to transition from passive endurance to active response. Maria was preparing to do something that would fundamentally change the nature of the situation they were all witnessing. The arrival of additional vehicles at the base's main gate had not gone unnoticed by the crowd in the courtyard. Military personnel were trained to recognize the signs of extraordinary circumstances, and the increasing number of unmarked sedans, the presence of personnel in civilian clothing who carried themselves with unmistakable military bearing, and the activation of communication protocols that most soldiers had never seen outside of wartime exercises, all indicated that this situation had escalated far beyond normal base authority. Lieutenant Amanda Foster, who had been observing from the edge of the crowd, suddenly realized that she recognized one of the newly arrived civilians. She had seen him during her assignment to the Pentagon 3 years earlier, though his name had never appeared on any organizational chart she had access to. He was one of the people who attended high-level briefings but never spoke, who had security clearances that required special badges, who existed in the gray areas between official military structure and the intelligence community. His presence at Fort Braxton meant that this incident had already been classified at levels that required special congressional oversight. It meant that everyone present would eventually be interviewed by investigators whose identities they would never learn. It meant that their careers, their future assignments, and possibly their civilian employment prospects would be affected by their witness to whatever was unfolding in the courtyard. But most significantly, it meant that Maria Castellanos was someone whose importance to national security had been drastically underestimated by everyone involved in ordering her public humiliation. The psychological pressure on Harrison had become unbearable as the implications of his actions became clear. His Pentagon contacts had stopped taking his calls. His immediate superiors had begun distancing themselves from his decisions. The legal officer had quietly suggested that he might want to consider retaining civilian counsel, which in military terms was equivalent to reading him his last rites. But it was the growing understanding of who Maria really was that caused his final psychological breakdown. The woman he had ordered stripped and humiliated wasn't just some troublemaking staff sergeant. She was a survivor of operations that had saved American lives, someone whose service record was so classified that acknowledging its existence required presidential authorization, someone whose silence had protected national security interests for an entire decade. And he had destroyed her because she refused to help him cover up his own incompetence. The weight of that realization, combined with the certain knowledge that his military career was over and his civilian prospects were nil, finally broke through the psychological defenses that had allowed him to justify his actions. His hands began shaking uncontrollably. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his face flushed with the kind of panic that comes from understanding that there are some mistakes that can never be corrected, some decisions that can never be undone. Command Sergeant Major Williams recognized the signs of an officer approaching complete psychological collapse and quietly positioned herself to intervene if Harrison's breakdown became a threat to others. But her primary concern remained Maria, whose continued silence and perfect military bearing were becoming increasingly ominous as the situation around her spiraled beyond anyone's control. The secure satellite communication that connected Fort Braxton directly to the White House Situation Room had been activated for the first time in the base's history. The president's national security advisor had been briefed on the situation, which meant that the most classified operations in American military history were now being discussed in the Oval Office. The political ramifications of acknowledging that such operations had occurred, that American soldiers had been deployed on missions that violated international law, and that the security of those operations had been compromised by military incompetence, were staggering. But the human element of the story was equally compelling. A soldier who had served their country in extraordinary circumstances, whose sacrifice had been erased from official records, and who was now being destroyed by the very system they had served so faithfully, represented everything that was both admirable and troubling about American military culture. The afternoon sun had reached its peak intensity, turning the courtyard into a furnace that tested the endurance of everyone present. But nobody moved, nobody left. Everyone understood that they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after their own military careers had ended. Something that would define their understanding of service, sacrifice, and the prices that some soldiers pay for doing their duty. And at the center of it all, Maria Castellanos continued to stand in perfect silence, her tattoo telling a story that officially had never happened, her dignity intact, despite everything that had been taken from her. But those who knew how to read the signs could see that her patience was approaching its end. Maria's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the courtyard with the force of a thunderclap. 10 years of enforced silence ended with 7 words that would be etched into the memory of everyone present. I remember every name they made me forget. The crowd seemed to inhale collectively and hold its breath. After hours of watching her endure humiliation in perfect military silence, her decision to speak transformed the entire dynamic of the situation. This wasn't just about military discipline anymore. This wasn't about following orders or maintaining the chain of command. This was about a human being who had finally reached the point where silence became complicity. Deputy Director Kane, who had just arrived at the base perimeter, heard those words through the encrypted communication link that connected her to the surveillance team monitoring the courtyard. She closed her eyes briefly, knowing that Maria's decision to break her operational silence meant that the most classified aspects of Operation Ghost Trail were about to be exposed to public scrutiny. But she also understood why it was happening. Kane had read Maria's complete psychological profile, including evaluations that weren't available to military personnel. She knew that survivors of classified operations often struggled with what psychologists called moral injury, the psychological damage that came from being forced to keep silent about experiences that defined their identity as soldiers and as human beings. Maria had carried the names of her fallen teammates in silence for a decade, unable to honor them publicly, unable to share their stories, unable even to acknowledge that their sacrifice had occurred. The psychological toll of such enforced secrecy was immense, and Kane had seen too many classified operators destroy themselves rather than continue carrying secrets that ate at their souls. Tommy Rodriguez had twin daughters, Maria continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. He carried their pictures in his helmet. Sarah Mitchell was going to be a teacher when she got out. She tutored Afghan children in her spare time. James Chen was studying engineering through correspondence courses. He wanted to build bridges. The names meant nothing to most of the crowd, but Command Sergeant Major Williams felt her knees go weak. Those weren't the names of the soldiers killed in Afghanistan 3 weeks ago. Those were much older names that appeared on classified casualty reports that she had helped process during her time at Pentagon Personnel Command. Names that officially belonged to soldiers killed in training accidents, but which she now realized belonged to Rangers who had died on a mission that didn't exist. David Park played guitar. Maria's voice carried a note of something that might have been tenderness. He was writing songs about the places we'd been, the people we'd met. Marcus Williams was going to propose to his girlfriend when we got back. He had the ring in his pack when he died. Antonio Rivera was the best medic I ever knew. He taught me that keeping people alive was about more than medical training. It was about refusing to give up, even when everything told you to quit. Dr. Morrison, the psychologist, recognized what she was witnessing. This wasn't just testimony. This was a form of therapeutic release that came from finally being able to honor people whose memory had been classified out of existence. Maria was performing a public memorial service for soldiers whose sacrifice had been erased from official records, whose families had been lied to about how and where they died, whose names could never appear on monuments or memorial walls. Marcus Thompson was 19 years old, Maria continued, her military bearing perfect, despite the tears that had begun streaming down her face. He joined the army to pay for college. He was going to study veterinary medicine because he said animals deserve to have someone care about them the way soldiers cared about each other. When the IED went off, he used his body to shield 2 Afghan civilians, children. He died protecting people he'd never met, in a place that doesn't appear on any map, on a mission that officially never happened. General Walsh had been trying to reach the Pentagon on her secure phone, but she found herself unable to look away from what was unfolding in the courtyard. She had been briefed on the psychological challenges faced by classified operators, but she had never witnessed someone choosing to sacrifice their own security clearance, their career, and, potentially, their freedom in order to honor fallen comrades. Because that's exactly what Maria was doing. Every name she spoke, every detail she revealed, every memory she shared was a violation of her security oath that could result in decades of imprisonment. She was knowingly destroying her own life in order to ensure that 7 Rangers who had died in service to their country would finally be remembered by someone other than herself. "We were supposed to be ghosts," Maria said, her voice taking on the flat, professional tone of someone delivering an after-action report. "No names on the mission orders, no records in official databases, no acknowledgement if we were captured or killed. We understood the rules, we accepted them, but they promised us that our sacrifice would matter, that our service would protect American lives, that if we died, it would be for something important." The crowd had grown completely silent. Even the normal background noise of base operations seemed muted, as if the entire installation was holding its breath. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would have consequences extending far beyond this single afternoon. Instead, our deaths were used to protect the careers of officers who sent us into impossible situations with inadequate intelligence and insufficient support. Our silence was used to cover up the incompetence that got us killed. Our sacrifice was classified not to protect national security, but to protect the reputations of people who didn't have the courage to acknowledge their mistakes. Harrison, who had been standing frozen in place since Maria began speaking, suddenly found his voice. "Sergeant, you need to stop talking. You're violating your security clearance. You're compromising ongoing operations." Maria turned to look at him directly for the first time since the ordeal began. Her dark eyes, still streaming with tears, held a combination of pity and contempt that made him step backward involuntarily. "Sir, with respect, there are no ongoing operations to compromise. Operation Ghost Trail ended 10 years ago when Alpha Team died in the mountains. What's been ongoing for the past decade is a cover-up designed to protect officers like you who value their careers more than the lives of the soldiers they command." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Everyone in the crowd understood that they had just heard a decorated ranger accuse a lieutenant colonel of cowardice, of using classified operations to hide his own failures, of allowing good soldiers to die in order to protect his reputation. Kane, monitoring the situation through encrypted communications, knew that the security implications of Maria's testimony were catastrophic. But she also knew that attempting to silence her now would only make the situation worse. The crowd included dozens of soldiers, many of whom were recording the proceedings on their phones. The story was already spreading beyond any possibility of containment. More importantly, Kane recognized the tactical brilliance of what Maria was doing. By speaking publicly about classified operations, she was forcing the government to make a choice: acknowledge that the operations had occurred and deal with the political consequences, or continue the cover-up and face the moral consequences of destroying a hero who had sacrificed everything for her country. "I've carried their names in silence for 10 years, Maria said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I've honored their memory in the only way I was allowed to, in permanent ink on my body, in private ceremonies that no one else could attend, in sleepless nights when I remembered their faces and their dreams and their final moments. But I won't carry the shame of covering up how they died. I won't participate in erasing their sacrifice to protect the reputations of officers who don't deserve to wear the uniform they died defending. She turned to face the crowd directly, her spine straight, her shoulders square, her bearing that of a soldier delivering the most important briefing of her career. These men died because they were Rangers, because they volunteered for the most dangerous missions their country could devise, because they believed that their sacrifice would matter, that their service would make a difference, that their death would protect American lives. They deserved better than being forgotten. They deserved better than having their sacrifice classified out of existence. They deserved better than dying to protect the careers of cowards. The silence that followed was complete and profound. In breaking her decade-long silence, Maria had not only honored her fallen teammates, but had also fundamentally changed the nature of everything that would follow. There could be no going back to business as usual, no quiet resolution that preserved everyone's careers and reputations. The truth was now public, and it demanded a reckoning. The first soldier to move was Private First Class Danny Martinez, the same 19-year-old who had first whispered about ghost operators hours earlier. Without a word, he unbuttoned his own uniform blouse and walked forward, placing it gently at Maria's feet. The gesture was simple, profound, and completely spontaneous. "For Rodriguez's daughters," he said quietly, stepping back to attention. The effect was immediate and irreversible. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Burke followed, removing her combat medic badge and laying it beside Martinez's blouse. For the bridges, Chen never got to build. One by one, soldiers began stepping forward, not in response to orders or military protocol, but from something deeper than discipline. They came from every unit on the base, every rank, every background. Combat veterans who recognized the weight of survivors' guilt. Young soldiers who understood they were witnessing something that would define their understanding of service. Seasoned NCOs who knew that some moments transcended normal military hierarchy. Master Sergeant Thompson removed his Ranger tab and placed it carefully on the growing pile, for Rangers who never made it home. Captain Foster added her officer's insignia, for missions that officially never happened. The pile grew with each offering. Name tags, rank insignia, unit patches, ribbons, badges. Each item carried the weight of respect, recognition, and apology. Not just for Maria, but for the 7 Rangers whose names she had finally been able to speak aloud. Deputy Director Kane watched the proceedings through encrypted satellite feed from her position at the base perimeter. She had witnessed many classified operations during her career, but she had never seen anything like this, a spontaneous ceremony that was simultaneously the most serious security breach in recent military history, and the most profound act of military honor she had ever witnessed. Her secure phone buzzed with a priority message from the White House. The president had been briefed on the situation and had made a decision that would reverberate through the military and intelligence communities for decades to come. Operation Ghost Trail was being declassified. The families of Alpha Team would finally learn how their sons and daughters had really died. Maria Castellanos would receive full recognition for her service, including medals that had been denied for security reasons. But most significantly, the president had ordered a complete review of all classified operations involving casualties to ensure that no other families were being lied to about how their loved ones had died in service to their country. Colonel Harrison stood frozen as the ceremony continued around him. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. His comfortable post-military life as a defense contractor was impossible now that his incompetence had been exposed in the most public way imaginable. But watching the spontaneous outpouring of respect for Maria, he began to understand the magnitude of what he had tried to destroy. She wasn't just a troublesome staff sergeant who had refused to follow orders. She was a genuine American hero whose service record was so extraordinary that it had been classified to protect national security. She had survived missions that killed her teammates. She had carried the psychological burden of classified operations for a decade. She had sacrificed recognition, promotion, and personal relationships to protect secrets that weren't her own. And when finally asked to participate in another cover-up, she had chosen honor over career, truth over comfort, integrity over survival. General Walsh stepped forward, her own insignia in hand. As she placed her stars at Maria's feet, she spoke loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear. Some uniforms can be stripped away, but honor cannot be taken from someone who has truly earned it. The crowd had grown to include nearly the entire base population. Word had spread through family housing, civilian work areas, and even to the local community outside the base gates. They came to witness something unprecedented. A soldier being publicly honored not by official ceremony, but by the spontaneous recognition of her peers. Command Sergeant Major Williams approached with a folded American flag, the kind presented to families of fallen soldiers. But instead of presenting it in the traditional manner, she draped it gently around Maria's shoulders. "For the Rangers who came home in flag-draped coffins," she said simply, "and for the one who carried them home in her heart." The symbolism was unmistakable. Maria had been stripped of her uniform, but she was being clothed in something far more meaningful. The recognition of her peers, the respect of her comrades, and the honor that no military regulation could define or diminish. Dr. Morrison, observing from her position at the edge of the crowd, witnessed something she would later describe in psychological journals as a perfect example of collective moral courage. The soldiers weren't just honoring Maria individually. They were collectively rejecting a system that would sacrifice integrity for convenience, that would destroy heroes to protect villains, that would classify truth to preserve comfortable lies. The secure communications network connecting Fort Braxton to Washington was overwhelmed with traffic as the implications of what was happening became clear to officials at the highest levels of government. This wasn't just about one soldier or one incident. This was about the fundamental relationship between the military and the people it was sworn to protect. Kane received authorization to approach the crowd and officially end Maria's decade of enforced silence. As she walked through the gathered soldiers, she carried documents that would transform Maria from a classified ghost into a publicly recognized hero. Presidential unit citations for Alpha Team. Individual medals for Maria's service that had been held in classified files for 10 years. Official recognition that Operation Ghost Trail had occurred and that its casualties were genuine combat deaths, not training accidents. But more importantly, she carried apologies. From the Pentagon for the cover-up, from the intelligence community for the enforced silence, from the president for allowing political considerations to override moral obligations. When Kane reached the center of the crowd, she found Maria standing wrapped in the American flag, surrounded by a mountain of military insignia that represented the respect of hundreds of soldiers. Her bearing was still perfect, her eyes still focused ahead, but the tears on her face reflected something that hadn't been there before: peace. "Staff Sergeant Castellanos," Kane said formally, her voice carrying across the silent courtyard. "On behalf of the President of the United States and the American people, I apologize for the injustice you have endured. Your service to this nation has been extraordinary, and your sacrifice has been unconscionable. Today, that changes." She handed Maria an envelope containing medals that had been classified for a decade, official recognition of service that had saved American lives, and most importantly, authorization to speak publicly about the Rangers whose memory she had carried in silence. "Your teammates will be remembered," Kane continued. "Their families will learn the truth. Their names will be added to the memorials they have always deserved. And you will receive the recognition you have earned through service that went far beyond any reasonable expectation." Maria's response was characteristically simple and profound. She looked directly at Kane, then at the crowd of soldiers who had honored her with their spontaneous ceremony. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But the only recognition that matters came from them." She gestured to the soldiers around her, the men and women who had chosen to honor truth over comfort, integrity over convenience, moral courage over institutional pressure. As the afternoon sun began to set over Fort Braxton, casting long shadows across the courtyard, the crowd slowly began to disperse. But the pile of military insignia remained, a monument to a moment when the military community had chosen to honor its values over its institutions. Maria walked away wrapped in the American flag, her dignity restored, her service finally acknowledged, her silence finally broken. Behind her, she left a changed military culture and a profound reminder that some things, honor, integrity, truth, cannot be stripped away by any regulation or order. The 7 Rangers of Alpha Team had finally come home, not in flag-draped coffins, but in the public recognition of their sacrifice and the honoring of their memory. They would be remembered not just by the woman who had carried their names in silence, but by a nation that had finally chosen truth over convenient fiction. Some battles are fought with weapons. Others are won with courage that refuses to be broken, integrity that cannot be compromised, and truth that will not remain buried. Maria Castellanos had fought both kinds of battles, and she had won them both. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.